Hello everybody, this is Johns Hopkins with Baltimore Heritage, and we're back with another of our 5-Minute Histories videos. And today I'm down on Pier 5 at the Inner Harbor. It's kind of a gray day, which seems appropriate because we're going to talk about the lighthouse, the crazy lighthouse behind me, the 7-foot Knoll lighthouse that was unscrewed from the bottom of the Chesapeake Bay and brought here in the 1980s. But before we get to that, I just want to say a quick thanks. Many of you got little envelopes in the mail recently asking you to renew your membership or join for the first time, and many of you have responded, so thank you, thank you. I will humbly suggest that if that letter is sitting on the edge of your desk, maybe take a look and consider a gift or join online. We'll put a link below. All right, let's jump to lighthouses, and before we get to ours, let's say a word generally. And lighthouses are an impressive lot. The oldest one in the United States was built in 1716 in Boston. It had to be rebuilt in 1783, but it's still in use. In fact, the 10 oldest lighthouses in the country are still in use, including the oldest, which is in Sandy Hook, New Jersey, and it was built in 1764. Our lighthouses, of course, are not the first lighthouses in the world. The first lighthouse to enter recorded history, at least in a big way, was the lighthouse at ancient Alexandria, built by Ptolemy the Great. At 330 feet tall, it was the tallest man-made structure in the world for several centuries. It was powered by a furnace at the top, and then the light from the furnace was reflected out to sea by a mirror. At the base was a statue of the sea god Poseidon to ward off all of the hazards from the sea. And Poseidon did very well for centuries and centuries, but eventually could not hold out, not from a sea attack, but an attack from land. A series of earthquakes beginning around 700 AD to 900 AD shook the lighthouse so much that it eventually was dismantled and turned into a medieval fort. The oldest lighthouse, if you're curious, in the world is in La Coruna, Spain, and it dates from 20 BC and is still there, so pretty neat. But let's fast forward to America, and today our lighthouses are not powered by torches, they're powered by electricity. And the first lighthouse in the country to go electric was none other than the Statue of Liberty. That's right, the torch that the Lady Liberty holds is in fact, or was a working lighthouse powered by electricity from 1886 until 1901. All right, so over here to the Chesapeake Bay in the 7-foot Knoll lighthouse, it was built in 1856 at the mouth of the Patapsco River, where it meets the bay, at a rocky shoals called the 7-foot Knoll, hence the 7-foot Knoll lighthouse. And it was a remote spot, and from the very beginning it was hard to staff. The U.S. Lighthouse Service that operated had a hard time keeping staff. In the 1870s, a report states that the assistant keeper's position went vacant for over a year. They couldn't find anybody to go out there. And then in the early 1900s, over a 3-year period, staff changed 6 times. Again, couldn't find anybody to stay. The U.S. Lighthouse Service, of course, couldn't change the weather, but they didn't do themselves any favors by essentially cutting the coal ration in half. The lighthouse had 2 stoves to keep warm in the winter, but the Lighthouse Service essentially gave enough coal only to fire 1. The report, in fact, concludes that the difficulty in getting people to stay is, quote, is in great measure due to the extremely uncomfortable condition of the station during the winter months on account of the cold, with no thanks to the Lighthouse Service itself. The duties of the keeper and assistant keeper were maybe not terribly complicated, but critical and often hazardous. They involved lighting the lamp each night and then making sure it stayed lit through all sorts of wind and rain and weather. And then in fog, arguably harder. Every 45 minutes, the fog bell had to be manually rewound. The head keeper had it a little better. He was allowed to bring his family with him out there. And let me share a few words from a young girl named Noli. She was born on the 7-foot Knoll lighthouse in the 1870s. Noli, 7-foot Knoll lighthouse, great name. And she says that things were actually pretty comfortable most of the year. There were 5 rooms. One had an extensive library. Another had a piano. And below them, there was a hog pen and chicken yard. She reports that they supplemented their diet with fish that they caught, and then wildfowl that were bashed against the side of the lighthouse during storms. So they ate pretty well. In the 1930s, so fast forward to the 1930s, The U.S. Coast Guard, which was now running our lighthouses, contemplated automating the 7-foot Knoll lighthouse, but folks, especially the shipping world, protested. In the 1930s, a keeper heroically rescued 5 sailors from drowning whose barge had overturned, and so the lighthouse was serving a role by warning of the shoals, but also in ship safety. But finally, in the late 1940s, I think 1949, the lighthouse was automated and stayed that way until 1988 when it was brought here to the Inner Harbor. And I'm going to wrap up by going back to the words that I said in the beginning, that it was unscrewed from the bottom of the bay. And that's because this type of lighthouse is called a screw pile lighthouse. It's the oldest one in Maryland. And the way it was built was you took giant metal rods or piles and you screwed them into the sandy floor of the bay, and then you erected your lighthouse, the building behind me, on top of that. So in the 1980s, it was unscrewed and then put on a boat and moved here. Today, it's operated by the Historic Ships in Baltimore group that also operate the Constellation and the USS Torsk. But I'll wrap up with one final word, again going back to our young girl, Noli, who said that the lighthouse was comfortable and that screw pile technique worked pretty well, except in the early spring when the ice floes shook it so that furniture went all over the place. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next time.